The year was 33 AD. Jerusalem was a powder keg of Roman iron and ancient whispers. In a dark alleyway far from the temple's gold lived Marcus, a man who worked with his hands, unaware that he was about to touch eternity. Have you ever wondered if an object can have a soul or a destiny? Late one night, a Roman centurion arrived with a heavy burden. It wasn't just any timber. It was a massive beam of cedar, ancient and blackened, as if it had been pulled from the heart of a storm. They called it the sentence wood. The soldiers claimed it was unearthed from a forbidden tomb, a place where the earth itself seemed to groan. "Make it fast," the centurion hissed, his eyes reflecting a strange fear. "This one is for a king." Marcus reached out to touch the grain, and the air in his shop suddenly turned ice cold. His sharpest saw snapped like a twig upon the first cut. Sparks flew, but they weren't red. They were a ghostly flickering blue. Why did the wood feel like it was pulsing under his palm? Why did he hear a low, rhythmic heartbeat echoing against his hammer? Marcus thought he was just building a cross for another criminal. He was wrong. He was preparing a throne for the savior of the world, and the wood already knew. The night deepened, and the workshop of Marcus became a battlefield. Usually wood obeys its master, but this cedar was alive with a terrifying resistance. Every time Marcus drove his plane across the surface, the timber warped and twisted, as if trying to escape his touch. The grain fought back. Splinters flew like tiny arrows, drawing blood from his face. Frustrated and trembling, he grabbed a heavy iron chisel to force the wood into submission. But as the steel pierced the grain, his heart stopped. Instead of resin, a thick, warm crimson fluid began to ooze from the cuts. It didn't smell like sap. It smelled of copper and salt. It was blood. Marcus stumbled back, gasping as the red stain spread across his calloused hands. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling in the hollow silence. Suddenly, a violent wind tore through the sealed room, extinguishing his lanterns. In the shifting shadows, the twisted knots of the wood transformed into agonizing faces, faces of those who had suffered, and one face that stood out among them all, a face of pure, silent sorrow. Just then, the Roman guards pounded on the door, their iron boots echoing like thunder. "Is it finished, carpenter? The prisoner is coming." Marcus looked at the bleeding timber, his mouth opening to scream that the wood was cursed, but no sound came out. He felt a sudden crushing weight on his chest, as if he were already carrying the beam himself. With a final desperate effort, he hammered the crossbeam into place. The sound of the strike didn't ring with the tone of metal. It sounded like a crack of thunder that shook the very foundation of his shop. The cross was done. As Marcus stood back, he realized he hadn't just built a scaffold. He had built a mirror, reflecting the darkness of his own soul and the mystery of the one about to carry it. The Roman centurion stepped into the shop, his presence bringing the stench of war and cold iron. Without a word, he tossed a small wooden tablet, a titulus, onto the workbench. It landed with a hollow thud that felt like a final judgment. "The cross is finished, carpenter, but the world needs to know why he hangs there," the officer barked. "Carve the title. In 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Make the letters deep. I want them to bleed as much as the man does." Marcus picked up the parchment containing the decree. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath hitched in his throat. "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." "King," Marcus stammered, his voice a dry rasp in the freezing air of the shop. "You ask me to name a common criminal a king. The Sanhedrin will have my head, and the Caesar will call it treason." The centurion leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, cynical light. "It is Pilate's mockery, carpenter. A joke for a man who thinks he can lead a rebellion with words. Now pick up your tools. The sun will not wait for your questions." Marcus grabbed his finest engraving chisel, but the moment he touched the metal to the wood, a strange, terrifying energy surged through him. It was as if the wood was no longer passive. It was screaming in silence. Every time he tried to carve the first letter of king, The iron tool became searingly hot, glowing red in his grip. His hands, which had shaped 1,000 beams without a tremor, now shook so violently that the tool slipped, slicing deep into his own palm. As his blood, the warm, thick blood of the craftsman, spilled onto the cedar, a miracle of horror occurred. The wood didn't just sit there. It seemed to drink the blood, drawing it into the grain until the red vanished. And where the blood was absorbed, the letters began to glow with a faint, supernatural luminescence, cutting through the shadows of the workshop. Marcus felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. He wasn't just writing a label. He was carving a prophecy. "I am writing a lie," he whispered to the empty room, his heart hammering like a trapped bird. Kings wear crowns of gold, not thorns. Kings sit on thrones of ivory, not the timber of a slave. But as he finished the final Greek word, the sky over Jerusalem split open with a roar of thunder that shook the very foundation of his house. In that flash of lightning, the words on the tablet seemed to transform. They didn't look like a Roman joke anymore. They looked like a divine decree etched in the fabric of eternity. Marcus, staring at his blood-stained hands and the glowing wood, realizing with a jolt of pure terror that he had just signed the death warrant of the only man who could save him. He had marked the wood, but the king's image had already etched itself upon his soul forever. The morning sun offered no warmth to the city of Jerusalem. The streets were a fever dream of screaming crowds and clashing Roman steel. Marcus found himself dragged by a force he couldn't fight, stumbling toward the way of sorrows. He wanted to run to burn his shop to the ground, but he was trapped at the front of the mob. Then the sound hit him, a heavy rhythmic thud of wood dragging over stone. It was a sound he knew in his bones. His wood. The crowd parted like an open wound. At the center of the storm was a man unrecognizable beneath a mask of blood and sweat. His back was shredded, a raw landscape of agony. And there, digging into those shattered shoulders, was the cross Marcus had built. Under the harsh daylight, the cedar looked darker, as if it were feeding on the man's pain. Marcus watched in horror as a jagged splinter, a piece he had failed to sand down in his haste, tore into the man's neck. A fresh crimson trail ran down the timber, and for a second Marcus felt the sting on his own skin. Suddenly, the man collapsed. The weight of the cedar, infused with the sins of a world, was impossible. The cross slammed onto the cobblestones with a sound that felt like the earth breaking. As the Roman guards kicked the fallen prisoner, Marcus surged forward in a moment of blind madness. He didn't know if he wanted to save the man or destroy his creation. But as he reached out, the man turned his head. Their eyes met, and the world stopped. There was no hatred in that gaze, no curse for the heavy beams, no accusation for the splinters. Instead, Marcus saw a love so ancient and deep it felt like drowning. The eyes said, "I carry this for you, so you won't have to." Marcus hit the ground, his breath gone. As the soldiers forced a stranger to lift the beam, Marcus stayed in the dust, watching the retreating shadow of the cross. He realized then that the wood didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the sacrifice. The master carpenter had become nothing but a splinter in the hands of the Almighty. The air atop Golgotha was thick with the scent of dry dust and impending doom. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes locked onto the cedar beams he had shaped with his own hands. The moment of impact was a sound he would never forget, the dull, sickening thud of a human body being thrown onto the wood. Then came the iron. Each strike of the Roman hammer echoed like a heartbeat in the void, driving the very nails Marcus had sharpened into the man's flesh. He watched in a trance of horror as the steel tore through bone, pinning the Savior to the rebellious timber. But as the soldiers struggled to hoist the cross into the air, something impossible happened. The wood didn't just stand. It groaned under a weight that defied the laws of nature. The sky turned an unnatural bruised purple, and the earth began to tremble beneath the cross's base. Marcus realized then that the man wasn't just hanging on the wood. The wood was struggling to hold the man. It was as if the cedar itself was weeping its grain, soaked in a blood that felt heavier than lead. This wasn't just the weight of a body. Marcus felt the crushing gravity of every secret sin and every hollow lie he had ever lived. The cross no longer looked like an instrument of death. It had become a cosmic anchor holding a falling world together. Marcus tried to scream to run, but he was bound to that wood by a thread of guilt stronger than any iron chain. He had built the scaffold of execution, but as the darkness swallowed the sun, he understood the terrifying truth. The man on his wood was building the only bridge back to heaven. As the man on the cross breathed his last, the sun didn't just fade, it vanished. At high noon, a terrifying supernatural midnight smothered Jerusalem. The earth let out a low, guttural roar as the very veil of the temple tore in two. Marcus fled the hill like a man pursued by 1,000 demons. His lungs burned, his sandals shredded by the trembling rocks, his mind fractured by the sound of the world splitting open. He burst through the doors of his workshop, desperate for sanctuary, but he found a nightmare instead. Inside the darkness of his shop, the wood was alive. Every timber he owned, the sturdy oak, the fragrant cypress, the ancient olive, was weeping. Under the invisible pressure of a cosmic grief, the wood began to splinter and crack with a sound like breaking bones. It was as if every tree on earth felt the agony of the cedar on Golgotha. Marcus stumbled toward his workbench, but when he looked down, he let out a blood-curdling scream. The crimson fluid from the cross was now seeping from the pores of his floorboards, his walls, and even his steel tools. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of copper and salt until he could taste death on his tongue. He looked at his right hand, the hand that had held the hammer. The jagged splinter from the Way of Sorrows remained embedded deep in his palm, glowing with a ghostly golden fire that refused to die. He tried to tear it out, but the pain wasn't just in his flesh. It was a soul-deep ache that whispered a single devastating truth. Your hands built the throne of his suffering. Outside, the thunder didn't just roar. It spoke. Every crash sounded like the Roman hammer hitting the iron nail. Marcus realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that he could never burn this shop enough to escape the memory. He could never wash his hands enough to be clean. His greatest masterpiece was a cosmic murder, and his victim was the creator of the very trees he had spent his life cutting down.